Hey guys, welcome back. So in this video we will be going through one question on experiment based concepts, and if you haven't watched my previous video where I explained concepts on experiment based questions, do watch that video before coming on to this video, as it would be easier for you to understand. I have included the link for that video in the description as well, so do check it out. And yeah, so without any further ado, let's begin. Raja wanted to investigate how the amount of light affects the growth of a type of plant. The diagram below shows each of his setups in a clear glass tank. Okay, so first let's look at the question stem. We are given two main things. Actually, we're given three main things. First is the aim of his experiment, which is to investigate how the amount of light affects the growth of a type of plant. This is his main aim. Okay, and he has identified the changed variable, which is the amount of light, and we are given the measured variable, which is the growth of a type of plant. Okay, so on a side note, if you guys haven't watched my previous video where I explained concepts and some tips on answering these kind of experiment based questions, do watch that video first, as it would be easy for you to understand. I have included the link for that video in my description. So yeah, okay, so now heading back to the question, we are also given that he uses a clear glass tank. Okay, so a clear glass tank indicates that it is transparent, and as all of you would know, transparent objects or materials allow most light to pass through. Right? Okay, so we are given two setups. I shall label them as A and B respectively. Okay, so both setups have a light source. That's good. Each setup has 5 living plants, and the type of soil is also the same. We are also given that they use the same glass tank, so these two tanks are also transparent. But the main difference between these two setups is that in setup A, the glass tank is covered with tracing paper, and in setup B, the glass tank is covered with black paper. So what's the difference? Tracing paper is translucent. And the thing about translucent materials or objects is that they allow some light, note this, some light to pass through. And black paper, on the other hand, is opaque. And opaque objects or materials, they allow no light to pass through. Okay, and so setups A and B would be the experimental setups. Okay, A and B, these are the experimental setups. Okay, so the question is, which one of the following could be used as a control for his experiment? Okay, so what is a control setup? A control setup is basically the exact same as an experimental setup. I'll just write it down. The control setup is the exact same as your experimental setup, but the only difference is that it lacks a change variable, meaning that we remove the changed variable. Okay, and in this case, the changed variable is the amount of light. Is the amount of light. So we have the amount of light. So now here is a catch. Many students, they get confused between two phrases. One is amount of light, and the second one is presence of light. Now, these two might seem similar, but in actual fact, they're very different. Let me explain to you why. So, amount of light is when you have a light source. A light source is present in all experimental setups, and the light intensity within each setup is different. So let's say I have setup P, which is covered with a translucent piece of paper. Okay, and we have a light source, and then we have setup Q, again we have a light source as usual, but this time setup Q is covered with a opaque piece of paper. And then lastly we have setup R, which is uncovered. We have a light source and there's no covering on top of R. Oh yeah, I forgot to mention that all these tanks are transparent. Okay, let me just write it down. All these tanks, okay, I'm talking about the tanks, I'm not talking about the coverings. So to avoid confusion, I'll just write it down. The blue covering is translucent and the black covering is opaque. Now the color of the text and the color of the highlighted region, just make sure that you take note of them. Okay, so if you see in setup P, we have a translucent piece of covering. So this would naturally mean that some amount of light is able to enter the setup. Now if we look at setup, this is because translucent materials, they allow some light to pass through, as stated over here, right? Now setup Q is covered with an opaque piece of paper, and opaque materials or surfaces, they do not allow light to pass through. So again in setup Q we would have no light. And now in setup R, since it's uncovered and the tank or the box is transparent is what? It allows most amount of light to pass through, right? So here we would have most amount of light. So now if you see in all three setups P, Q and R, we have a light source, right? The only difference is the light intensity within each setup, which is varied by the type of covering that is surrounding each setup, each tank. So that is so that's a gist of amount of light. When you have a light source, but the intensity of light within each setup is different. And now if we look at presence of light, that's a totally different scenario. When we have two setups, let's say X and Y. Okay, setup X and Y, they are exactly identical in nature. Both setups are transparent. Both tanks are transparent. I'll just write it down again. The only difference is that in X we have a light source, in Y we don't have a light source. So this would mean that X contains light, not contains, but setup X light is present. In setup X light is present, but in Y there is no light source. The light source is missing. So this would mean that no light is present in Y. So this is the main difference between presence of light and versus amount of light. So I hope that you have gotten this. Excuse me. So now that this is cleared, it would be quite easy for us to solve this question. So as I wrote before, in a control setup, we remove the change variable, which is the amount of light. So in this case, the factor which is affecting the amount of light is the type of covering on top of each setup, on top of each tank. In setup A we have a translucent piece of tracing paper. In setup B, we have a opaque piece of black paper, and this would mean that for the control setup, we need to remove this paper, these coverings, which would mean that the control setup, would not have any covering on top of it. It would be something like setup R over here, where there is no piece of paper surrounding the tank. So if we look at all the options, we have option 1, 2, 3 and 4, where in which options 1, 3 and 4 there is some form of covering. Options 1 and 4, they are covered with a black paper, which is opaque, but we need a transparent setup, as we need maximum amount of light to enter the tank for a control setup, right? We need to remove that factor which is affecting the light intensity. So we cannot have any paper, any piece of covering. So options 1 and 4 would be automatically incorrect. Same is for option 3. We have tracing paper, which is again translucent, so it would reduce the amount of light which is entering the tank. So option 3 would also be incorrect. This leaves us with option 2, and if we observe it carefully, it actually makes sense, because in option 2 we don't have any covering surrounding the tank, right? It is just a tank. It's a transparent glass tank without any covering. So this would mean that maximum amount of light is able to enter the tank, right? Because we have removed the factor which is affecting the light intensity. So the answer would be 2. So basically the gist of these questions, of these experiment based questions, of such questions, is that we observe the experimental setups, find the changed variable, and in the options given, we choose that particular option in which the changed variable is removed. But of course you need to look at the other factors as well. To ensure a fair test, you guys would know that you can only change one variable. You can't have more than one variable changed. So just make sure that the remaining variables, they are kept constant, they are controlled, and these variables are usually known as controlled variables. I have explained them in my previous video, in my previous walkthrough, so do be sure to check that out. So these are the factors of variables which are kept constant throughout the whole experiment, which in this case would be the type of soil used, the number of plants, and the type of tank used, so on and so forth. So these variables have to be kept constant. So just make sure that whichever option you choose, in that option these controlled variables are kept constant. So the experimental setups, we have 5 plants, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and the controlled setup should also have 5 plants, right? So yeah, just look out for these factors as well. Yep, so that was it for this question. Although I took quite some time to explain this question, if you do the same, if you annotate the question similarly for experiment based questions, it shouldn't be much of a problem for you to answer these type of questions, because in your PSLE examination this type of questions would carry about 9 to 10 marks on average. So yeah, do practice as many questions as you can on experiment based concepts, be it open-ended or MCQ. And if you have any doubts for this regarding this question I went through, feel free to put them down in the comment section below, and I will do my best to answer them. And on a side note, if you liked my video, if you enjoyed it, don't forget to hit the like button, click on the subscribe button, and do click on the notification icon so that you're notified whenever I post a new video. So do stay tuned for my next video, and till then, goodbye.